Welcome to Narrative. My name is Veronica, and today we are talking about a brief overview of the history of fantasy because this video is brought to you by the fury of hearing new fans to fantasy, specifically fans of Sarah J Maas, claiming that she invented stuff like dragons and magic and like other staple elements of fantasy stories. So with as much respect as I possibly can muster, here's a brief overview of the fantasy genre's history. This is not an exhaustive list. I can't cover everyone. So if there is someone big and influential that you think that belongs in this list, drop them down below. But I will be covering the big names that are part of the fantasy genre zeitgeist, you know, the bigger influential that has actually had an impact on the genre, even if I think that some of my favorite authors and stories belong on this list because I know they're not part of the, household awareness. They haven't really had the impact that these authors have had. Like Trudy Kahneman, I love her. You should totally go and read the Black Magician series. It's great. I think that she belongs on this list, but she's not going to be on the list because not a lot of other people know about her. But my point being is that if I have missed someone that you think really should be on this list, drop them down in the comments. Thank you. I'm going to have my phone with me because there's so many numbers and names I'm going to have to reference because it took me like 2 days to put together this list, okay? If this comes across anyone who has said stuff like this before, hello. Welcome to fantasy. We do love having you here and we hope you enjoy this lovely descent into madness. It's gonna be great. This is not meant to be a personal attack. It is a chance to learn some more and learn about the history of this genre that you are now participating in. All we ask is that you refrain from erasing the history and wrongfully crediting people for staple fantasy elements that have existed for, you're gonna see, a really long time. Maas did not invent fantasy. Let's just start there. Maas didn't even reinvent it, even slightly. She did not invent dragons, and she did in fact not invent the Fae or any of the other fairy tales or mythology staple fantasy elements that she has incorporated into her writing. She might have done it well. She didn't, but that doesn't mean that she invented it. Before I go off on a tangent about that, fantasy has a long and rich history that goes all the way back to our first ever recorded story, Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh has been credited with being written circa 2100 BCE, that means before current era. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a great Babylonian poem about a semi-mythic king of Uruk, which was one of the most important cities of the ancient Mesopotamia era? Now, Uruk is best known as the birthplace of writing. I mean, how great is that? Somewhere around 3200 BCE. And the story itself is about Gilgamesh who goes on a trip for just down on a journey to find eternal life and the meaning of life. Jumping forward about 1,000 years, we get to Homer, the writer of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which was written somewhere around 800 to 700 BCE. Of course, we don't have a specific date because these were originally orally transmitted and then later on written down. And these books basically deal with God's needs of being petty and messy. But I think most people are aware of these, so I'll just leave it at that. Next, we jump another somewhat 1,000 years and get to Beowulf. This was written somewhere between 700 and 900 CE, which current era. So we've passed Jesus and all of that. Beowulf is an epic poem written in Old English and widely considered the oldest surviving story written in English. But this dude is from my neck of the woods, Sweden! Woohoo! So he's a king in part of the kind of southern half of Sweden. And basically the story of Beowulf is him just traveling around Scandinavia and fighting a lot of supernatural creatures. That's basically what Beowulf is. Which ends with him, like in older days, fighting a dragon, slaying the dragon and dying. And then the guy who still stayed, because the rest of the dudes just kind of ran away, grabbed the gold and went back and like condemned the others. That's how Beowulf ends. Cliff notes, you know? Then comes the Eddas, which is the poetic and the prose Edda, who, as if they're people, that lays the foundation for how we view Norse mythology today. Pretty much everything that we perceive as Norse mythology comes from the Eddas, and it was written somewhere circa 1200 CE. So the prose Edda is written by someone who is called Snorri Sturluson, and it's always fun to talk about because in Swedish his first name translates, oh wow, his first name is Snorre, which is slang for penis in Swedish. So when we were learning about the Eddas and everything in school, there was a lot of snickering, you know, it's just like. But Snorri was an Icelandic historian and poet and put this together. Now there's two different ones. There's a poetic and there's a prose Edda. Snorri is credited for writing the prose, but not the poetic. The poetic one is credited to an unknown author. But these two manuscripts are combined, called the poetic and the prose Edda. And yeah, they lay the foundation for Norse mythology, essentially. Here's where we pause a little bit, because we're not talking about the fantasy genre in and of itself, but in 1440, we have the invention of the printing press in Europe, and this revolutionized the written word. This started the printing revolution and gave commoners access to the written word in a way that they hadn't before. Now, yes, most of them were still illiterate, but they still now had access to it because the printing press made it so that it was much easier and cheaper to produce books or pamphlets and stuff that they could spread around, because otherwise it had been kind of only available to the elites, who then were also the ones telling the people how to think, because they were the only ones who could read. So this revolutionized the written word and the access to knowledge that we had not seen before. And now that more and more people had access to the written word, it became part of how people were challenging and criticizing the Catholic Church. And eventually, this led to the Protestant Reformation. In 1525, Martin Luther was one of the main people who were criticizing the church and through the usage of the written word. And he became the first ever best-selling author in the early modern period. And this is thanks to having written over 500,000 pieces of work between 1517 and 1525. He created that much. And I was just like, he was really writing like his life depended on it. And it probably did, because he was criticizing the church. I do want to add here though that this was the invention that took place in Europe. Both China and Korea already had printing presses at least 200 years beforehand, but there's no indication that Gutenberg. There's no indication that Gutenberg had any influence from theirs and independently developed this invention anyway. So I just wanted to make a note of that. Leaving the printing press behind, we move into the era of playwrights in the mid-1500s. And here we have Shakespeare, we have Marlowe, we have Middleton, Webster, and a lot more. Like collectively, they were known as the Elizabethan playwright, and this was considered the golden age of drama. Thanks to Elizabeth I's patronage of the arts that she used to glorify herself and her family, regular street performers performers were able to become professional entertainers. There's a lot that happens in this time period here, and I do encourage that you go out and look at it because it's super interesting, but there's so much and like so many details. I can't linger on it. It would be a whole video on its own. So just go out and look at it yourself. But why I included the playwrights in this list is because while many of them were commentary on social structures and critiques and stuff, equally as many, if not more, in order to kind of hide their social commentary or criticism, were stories that included a lot of fantastical elements. Just an example to get you started, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Then in 1698, I need to read this woman's name because French is not my language. In 1969, Marie Catherine d'Aulnoy, it's gonna be on screen, she published The Green Serpent. This story is based on the myth of Eros and Psyche, and the story itself, not the Eros and Psyche one, but The Green Serpent, it lays the foundation for a lot of fairy tale elements that we are used to today. Sleeping Beauty being cursed by a furious fairy that didn't get invited to the party, as in the story. Descending to Hades to free your loved one. 3 tests made up by the evil queen or fairy that the protagonist receives magical help to pass. Sounds familiar? Now, all of these are part of this story, The Green Serpent, and it has clearly had a big impact on the fantasy genre. Moving on, in 1812, we have very familiar stories, kind of like The Green Serpent, by the brothers Grimm. Now, these stories were not written by these brothers, but they were collected and published under their name, which then pushed them into the general populace awareness and interest. Quote, they established a methodology for collecting and recording folk stories that became the basis for folklore studies. And if you're not necessarily familiar with the name Brother Grimm's, put the S where it's supposed to be, Brothers Grimm. Then in their collections were stories like Cinderella, there was the Little Red Riding Hood and Snow White and the Frog Prince and a lot of others. So yeah, if you're interested in those type of stories, check them out. Brothers Grimm did not do the Disney version of them. It is like very gory and scary. That was supposed to scare children into behaving correctly. So just keep that in mind if you're a little bit scared of that stuff. Not long after this, we have Lewis Carroll publishing Alice in Wonderland in 1865. Do I really need to explain this? It's still one of the most popular English literature works out there. It has never gone out of print. We use it, we love it so much that it has literally never gone out of print, and it has been translated to over 174 languages across the globe. I think it's safe to say everyone here is gonna know about Alice in Wonderland, so I'm gonna move on. That means we have finally reached the 1900s, and starting off is the Oz saga, you know, Dorothy and Tin Man and all of that stuff, published on like exactly 1900s. 1900. Language is hard sometimes. The Oz Saga is written by L. Frank Baum, and he went on to write 14 books in the series. There's many more because it's kind of like at least 2 other authors picked up the mantle afterwards. So if you want to learn more about that, just Google the Oz Saga. And this is the point where a lot of things start happening. It really takes off for modern fantasy. We have a lot of big names, a lot of big impacts on the genre, and the people entering into the genre's zeitgeist, and even the general zeitgeist becoming household names outside of the fantasy genre. So yeah, buckle up. And starting off, of course, in the 1950s, you have the 2 bros that added stuff into their story because they were having a discussion about, no, you can't do that in fantasy like this. And then they put it in there and made it work just to like, to the other. And that's kind of how their friendship was. Of course, I'm talking... Oh my god. I'm talking about Tolkien and Lewis. They are the ones that people tend to think of as the most influential fantasy authors that has attributed to the defaulting kind of the Eurocentric medieval times in fantasy. So yeah, you Lord of the Rings, Narnia, yeah, you know. And in 1968, we have two very talented, very prominent authors taking the stage. We have Ursula K. Le Guin with her Earthsea series, and you have Anne McCaffrey, I always say Anne McCaffrey with her Dragon Riders of Pern. Le Guin might be one of the most iconic authors in the genre. Her work earned her 6 Nebula Awards and 7 Hugo Awards, just to name 2. She wrote novels, she wrote poetry, she wrote essays and children's stories. Like, there was nothing that this woman hadn't done, and done it so well that people were praising her for it. In 2000, she was named a living legend by the Library of Congress. So if you don't know who she is, definitely check it out. She's one of the biggest names in fantasy. Moving on to McCaffrey, she was the first woman to ever win a Hugo Award, and she was the first woman to ever win a Nebula Award in 68 and 69, respectively. In 2005, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America named her its 22nd Grandmaster. Now, I know, I know that the Dragon Riders of Pern is technically classified as a science fiction. Technically, like science fantasy. Depending on where you look, you see science fiction or science fantasy. I'm leaning more towards science fantasy for it, which is why I'm also including it in this list. Because it had such a huge impact on the fantasy genre in and of itself. I mean, if just listen to this and ask yourself if you've ever heard of this in a different fantasy book that you've read. A human rider has a telepathic bond with their dragon, formed by impression at the dragon's hatching. The bonding instantly creates a very close, lifelong relationship. The dragon almost invariably commits suicide at the rider's death, and a rider whose dragon dies bears a deep, emotional wound which can never fully heal. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? J.R.R. Martin started his publishing career in 1970 with short stories. Today, of course, he is most known for the Game of Thrones TV series that the book name is called A Song of Ice and Fire. And you might also know at least one of his short stories because they adapted it into a TV series called The Night Flyers. The short story is also called Night Flyers. I love this series. I really love this series. So ooh, I think that you should watch it. Just be aware that it is dark. So yeah, there's some blood and stuff going on, but totally worth it. The acting is amazing. The storyline is intriguing. It's like, I need to rewatch it. So go watch it or read it. I haven't actually read the short story, so maybe, but at least watch it. Like, Martin has so many awards under his belt. I can't go through them all. Just, I don't know. Check his Wikipedia. He's really famous, so And here's where we get Terry Pratchett. He started his publishing career in 1971, which did surprise me. I thought he started before Martin, but apparently not. But it would be over a decade until he released the first book in his Discworld series, which arguably he might be the most famous for today. The Color of Magic. Yes, you should read it. It's super funny, and if you pay attention, you're gonna see the social commentary and the juxtaposition of stuff, and it's so fun. It's one of the first books that actually made me laugh out loud. Like, I was on a train and I just laughed out loud. It's one of the few books that has ever managed to do that for me. So highly recommend it. It's not for everyone, but I do think that it's worth giving it a shot. It's quite funny. He was knighted for his services to literature, and among many awards, he also received the World Fantasy Award of Life Achievement. In 1972, David and Leigh, almost at Bardugo, that's not right. That comes later. David and Leigh Eddings came onto the scene. They definitely expanded the fantasy genre beyond the kind of Tolkien-esque standard that had appeared in the fantasy genre, and showcased that you could write stories, high fantasy stories, that didn't necessarily include dwarves and elves and all of that stuff. Just behind the Eddings, there is Anne Rice in 1976. 76. You might have heard of her work, Interview with the Vampire. That's Anne Rice. And she might have been the one to popularize a more sympathetic view and approach of supernatural creatures that we see today. And, you know, she has the little achievement of being one of the most best-selling authors in modern times. You know, that little thing. 1984, not the book, the year, is the year of Neil Gaiman. Gaiman? I want to say Gaiman, but according to phonetics, it's Gaiman. So I'm gonna go with the phonetics here. And he is a household name today thanks to works like Sandman, Stardust, Good Omens, and American Gods. So pretty much everyone knows about him today, even outside of fantasy. He has a lot of awards and he has created works from like high fantasy to like dark children's fairy tales, and like has a lot of different things in different mediums. So he's done a lot. He might be one of the most prolific authors that has impacted the fantasy genre in the past, say, 100 years. Now, speaking of prolific authors, we move into Robert Jordan. In 1990, so not at all that long ago. We're on the home stretch now, people. We're on the home stretch. He began writing or publishing the Wheel of Time series, which also now has an adaptation for TV. Have you watched it? What did you think? I have a little bit of mixed feeling. Wheel of Time would eventually be completed by Brandon Sanderson, and we're talking about him in a little bit. He's coming up soon, okay? In 2021, okay, I need to read this because it's numbers. In 2021, the series had sold over 90 million copies worldwide, which makes it one of the best-selling epic fantasy series since The Lord of the Rings. So, safe to say he's had a big impact on the genre. Robin Hobb graced us with her writing in 1995 when she started writing the Farseer trilogy. She had written books earlier under a different name, but it's the Robin Hobb name that is the one that has impacted fantasy. That's why I'm going with that name and that time. She wrote these stories in first-person point of view, which is not the standard for fantasy, which tends to be third-person omniscient. In 2005, yes, in 2005, The Times described her as one of the great modern fantasy writers, and she has won numerous awards, which kind of supports that claim. In 1997, J.K. Rowling started publishing the Harry Potter series, which is essentially her only claim to fame, you know, other than being the biggest piece of shit. Crossing into the 2000s, we have Christopher Paolini publishing his first book in the Inheritance Cycle in 2002. He was 15 when why did I say that like an announcer? He was 15! He was 15 when he started writing, or when he wrote the first draft of the Aragon book, the first book in the series, but it would take another 2 or so years before he self-published it together, or with the help of his parents. And it would then, about a year later, be picked up by an imprint of the Random House children's books and re-released in 2003, where it became an instant bestseller. The Inheritance Cycle is a staple of fantasy today, even if a lot of the elements that are included in it had already been done some 40 years before by McCaffrey. Only a few years later, we have Stephanie Meyers coming onto the stage with Twilight, and I really don't think that I need to talk about this because it's pretty much still being talked about today. Everyone is kind of aware of what Twilight is, and the hype that happened, and the rush of supernatural and the vampire and werewolf kind of stories that took hold of the publishing world just after. Now, the same year, in 2005, Brandon Sanderson published his first story, Elantris. Elantris? I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. And since then, he is just taking the fantasy genre by storm. He has over 70 books or works published. It's just safe to say this dude has kept busy, okay? He also finished the Wheel of Time series for Jordan when he passed away. I mean, this guy has kept busy, all right? 2010 marks the start of Sarah J Maas' publishing career. She wrote the first version of Throne of Glass, then named Queen of Glass. Glass and Glass. So just so you know, I have a range of how I pronounce things, I guess. She wrote it and published it on fictionpress.com. There it became very popular and then eventually got picked up by a publisher. Throne of Glass is essentially a fairy tale retelling of the Cinderella story. And likewise, A Court of I can't speak anymore. A Court of Thorns and Roses is a retelling, or a loose retelling, but still a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. And to wrap it up, in 2015, Leigh Bardugo, Leigh? I just realized I don't know how to pronounce this name. Anyway, that's Miss Bardugo. Ma'am Bardugo? Jesus, I'm a mess. Leigh Bardugo, I'm gonna go with that pronunciation. I don't know if it's correct or not, but we're going with it. She released Shadow and Bone in 2015. Six of Crows were, why have I put 13? I think I might have messed up in my little research here. I will insert the correct numbers of the screen because I don't, what? All of these are set in the Grishaverse and they were adapted for the screen for TV at a later point. But what was very interesting to learn was that she also wrote the first book in the DC Icons series, which is DC Comics kind of novelized version of the comics. And she wrote the first book about Wonder Woman. So that was really cool. That was really neat. That's where I'm gonna leave the list. We have so many talented fantasy authors out there who are active and producing, but none that I really feel have reached the same level of impact on the genre yet, which is why I'm leaving it in 2015 roughly, even though we're almost 10 years ahead. So, you know, that impact can be a little bit fluctuating. It doesn't have to be in the same year that they publish. You can get big on something at a later time. So I'm gonna leave it in about a decade back in time. And as I said at the beginning of the video, if you feel like I missed someone really important, or you just wanna share really good fantasy authors, drop them down below. We all like recommendations and we can all make this whole list a bit more complete together. My final thoughts here is that there's two authors that currently are the biggest names in fantasy, and like people tend to end up in one of these two camps when they enter into fantasy the first time. When you get used to the genre a little bit, you tend to spread out, that's fine. But like the entryway into fantasy tends to be Sanderson or Maas at this point in time. And as much as I don't like Maas, she is part of fantasy. Romantasy is part of fantasy, no matter how some people might disagree. It is fantasy no matter what. So you see, there's a long, rich history in fantasy, and Maas did not invent any of the staple fantasy elements that have existed in the narratives for thousands of years. She might have brought it to the forefront of your mind, but have some humility when you step into a new space and be open to learning. Or at the very least, be honest and conscious about the fact that your first introduction to fantasy was Maas and that you really haven't really read outside of romantasy. Don't erase the history of the genre and give credit where credit is due. Thank you very much for being here. I hope you enjoyed your time. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit subscribe, maybe even a like button, maybe a comment. Ooh, I'm asking for a lot today. But anyways, this video took a lot out of me, okay? Anyway, I hope that you have a wonderful day, night, wherever you are in the time stream, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!